What makes desecration different from ordinary damage? A flag can be replaced, a wall repaired, a courtroom cleaned. But in desecration, the injury is not only to the thing, it is to the value the thing was trusted to carry. Then what makes desecration different from ordinary insult? An insult attacks a person, group, or belief directly. Desecration attacks through a mediator, a symbol, place, office, ritual, memory, body, text, or practice that has been set apart from ordinary use. The desecrator does not merely say the value is contemptible. He makes the value's own vessel carry the contempt. This is what makes desecration politically powerful. It creates conflict at the level of reverence. One side sees violation. Another is told to see restoration. One side sees sacrilege, corruption, or cruelty. Another is told to see courage, purification, or revenge. That split is the opening. Once the public is fighting over whether the act was desecration or defense, the desecrator has already seized the sacred thing and made it serve power. Desecration is weaponized when it is organized into a repeatable method of power. Donald Trump has mastered this approach. Desecrations are not isolated provocations, they form a political grammar. Allegation defines the sacred thing as under attack. Degradation marks the enemy as unworthy of ordinary protection. Retaliatory violation then receives the emotional appearance of defense, dividing and distracting the public. So how does the work? The first part prepares the ground. Trump claims that some protected value has already been violated by enemies. The nation has been invaded, the election was stolen, the courts are corrupt, the media is fake, the prosecutors are weaponized, the museums are ideological, the schools are indoctrinating children, or the people have been betrayed. This is the enabling condition. It creates the moral emergency in which ordinary limits begin to look naive, weak, or complicit. The second part is the desecrating inversion itself. Having claimed that enemies already violated the sacred object, Trump then commits his own violation in the name of rescue, purification, punishment, or restoration. Public office can be treated as private property because the leader claims to embody the people. Criminal prosecution can be turned against enemies because law has supposedly already been weaponized. Historical memory can be purged because museums have supposedly been corrupted. Sacred imagery can be appropriated because political loyalty has been fused with divine mission. Presidential access can be monetized because proximity to power has been reframed as tribute to the movement rather than trust held for the public. The third part is the purpose of the first two, division and distraction. The goal is not only to degrade a symbol, corrupt a practice, or shock an audience. The deeper goal is to prevent coordinated resistance. Once public life is flooded with transgression, outrage, counter-outrage, denial, reinterpretation, and retaliatory justification, citizens no longer respond to a common reality. They are forced into competing moral emergencies. One side experiences desecration. Another is told that the desecration is actually restoration. One side sees corruption. Another is told that corruption is justice. One side sees cruelty. Another is told that cruelty is protection. In the resulting conflict and chaos, the treasury can be looted and power consolidated. The weaponization of desecration therefore forms a governing triad. Accusation and delegitimation justifies inversion and desecration, which produces division and distraction. The first element authorizes the second. The second produces the injury. The third harvests the political benefit. This structure is more powerful than ordinary hypocrisy. Hypocrisy violates a professed standard while pretending not to. Weaponized desecration goes further. It violates the standard while claiming that the violation is the only way to save the standard. It turns profanation into purification. It converts attack into defense. It makes the desecrator appear to his supporters as the one person willing to do what is necessary to protect the sacred thing. This is why the pattern is so destabilizing. A normal violation can be named, judged, and opposed. A weaponized violation arrives already wrapped in accusation. Before critics can say that a boundary has been crossed, the leader has already claimed that his enemies crossed it first. Before institutions can correct the falsehood, those institutions have already been accused of corruption. Before citizens can coordinate a response, they are pulled into a fight over whether the act is violation or restoration. The final purpose of the structure is itself triadic. Division and distraction work by combining three effects: emotional trauma, social radicalization, and precedential escalation. First, the pattern inflicts emotional trauma on the electorate. Desecration wounds because it attacks what people regard as protected: dignity, law, religion, memory, public office, national symbols, human belonging, or the dead. Repeated desecration produces exhaustion, grief, rage, disgust, and helplessness. Citizens are not merely asked to disagree about policy. They are forced to watch the things that anchor their moral and civic world degraded again and again. Second, the pattern radicalizes people against each other through competing information environments. The same act is interpreted in incompatible ways. For critics, it is desecration. For supporters, it is revenge, restoration, trolling, courage, or truth-telling. Each side is then given a different story about what happened, who violated the sacred thing, and who is defending it. The public does not merely disagree about values, it loses a shared frame for identifying violation at all. Third, the pattern creates precedent for increasingly extreme and transgressive policies. Each desecration tests the boundary. If the public absorbs it, excuses it, or becomes too divided to resist it, the next violation can go further. A sacred symbol can be politicized, then personalized, then monetized. A legal process can be criticized, then delegitimated, then reversed against enemies. A public institution can be attacked, then captured, then made to display loyalty. The first transgression weakens the boundary. The next one treats the weakened boundary as the new starting point. The inner purpose can therefore be stated like this: emotional trauma creates competing realities and enabling escalating transgression. Emotional trauma disorients the public. Competing realities prevent unified judgment. Escalating transgression converts yesterday's shock into tomorrow's precedent. This analysis examines Trump's patterns of desecration through that broader structure. The issue is not only that he violates sacred or quasi-sacred public meanings, it is that he repeatedly does so through a system that justifies the violation in advance, inverts its meaning while it occurs, and then uses the resulting confusion to divide the public and normalize the next breach. In each domain, the same question recurs: what protected value is being invoked? What mediator carries that value? How is that mediator degraded? And how is the degradation rebranded as defense or restoration? The answer differs across religion, law, death, memory, public office, cultural heritage, national symbolism, ethics, art, and identity. But the pattern remains consistent. Weaponized desecration does not simply destroy reverence. It captures reverence, redirects it, and uses it to make violation feel necessary and turned into a weapon of domination. Religious desecration produces conflict over who has the authority to speak for the sacred. It does not merely offend believers, it divides them into rival camps of recognition. One side sees the sacred being exploited by political power. The other is told that the same exploitation is proof that the leader stands with God, Christianity, religious liberty, or the persecuted faithful. The conflict is especially useful because it turns spiritual injury into political alignment. Criticism of the leader can be cast as hostility to religion itself, while loyalty to the leader can be made to feel like defense of the holy. In that struggle, the leader does not need to resolve theological meaning. He only needs to make sacred meaning contested enough to exploit. The triad of religious desecration is sacred presence, consecrated form, and profaning use. Religious desecration emerges when a sacred presence is mediated through a consecrated form, and that form is subjected to profaning use. The sacred presence may be God, divine order, holiness, spiritual truth, or the transcendent reality acknowledged by a religious tradition. The consecrated form is the material, ritual, or symbolic form through which that sacred presence is honored. An altar, church, mosque, temple, Torah scroll, Eucharistic vessel, relic, icon, burial ground, sacred text, or sacred image. Profaning use occurs when that form is treated as ordinary, contemptible, instrumental, or hostile to the purpose for which it was set apart. Each element changes the meaning of the others. The sacred presence gives the object or image more than practical value. The consecrated form makes the sacred presence vulnerable to human treatment. Profaning use converts that vulnerability into violation. This is why religious desecration is not merely physical damage. A sacred object can remain materially intact and still be desecrated if it is used in a way that contradicts its spiritual purpose. Conversely, ordinary damage to an ordinary object does not become desecration unless the object participates in a sacred order. The character of religious desecration is spiritual rupture. The relation between sacred presence and consecrated form is broken by a use that denies the holiness the form was meant to serve. Trump's use of Christian imagery shows how this rupture can be weaponized. His politics often begins by alleging that Christianity, religious liberty, or the nation's spiritual foundations are under attack by secular elites, immigrants, liberals, judges, educators, or cultural enemies. That allegation identifies a sacred value and frames opponents as profaners of it. But the countermove can itself become profaning. Sacred imagery is drawn into partisan self-representation, and the language of Christian defense is made to serve worldly domination. Trump's example appears when a political figure shares or circulates an image portraying himself in a Christ-like visual mode. The offense perceived by critics is not merely that the image is tasteless. The deeper injury arises from the triadic confusion of Christic holiness, sacred Christian iconography, and political self-glorification. The sacred presence is not denied outright, it is appropriated. The consecrated form, Christian visual association with Christ, becomes a vehicle for personal or political elevation. The profaning use is therefore not simple mockery, but substitution. The political self is placed inside a visual grammar normally reserved for divine humility, sacrifice, redemption, and worship. This makes the emotional impact especially sharp for believers because the image does not merely attack Christianity from outside. It appears to hollow out Christian symbolism from within by making it serve political power. The same movement that claims to defend sacred meaning against desecration converts that meaning into a personal iconography of rule. That is the weaponization of religious desecration. The sacred is invoked as threatened, then made to sanctify the threatener. Funerary desecration produces conflict over reverence, sacrifice, and custody of the dead. The dead cannot speak for themselves, which makes them powerful political instruments for the living. A leader can accuse enemies of dishonoring veterans, martyrs, ancestors, or national sacrifice, and then use that accusation to justify acts that turn mourning into spectacle or memory into self-glorification. The resulting conflict is not merely over taste or property. It is over who gets to claim fidelity to the dead and who is accused of betraying them. That conflict is valuable because it forces citizens to argue over mourning itself while power uses the dead as scenery. The triad of funerary desecration is dignity of the dead, memorial or bodily vessel, and violation of reverent custody. Desecration of the dead emerges when the dignity of the deceased is mediated through remains, graves, or memorial sites. And those forms are violated by disturbance, vandalism, exploitation, or irreverent handling. The dignity of the dead is the continuing moral significance attributed to the person who has died. The memorial or bodily vessel is the corpse, grave, cemetery, urn, tomb, marker, memorial, burial site, or memorial landscape through which that dignity is preserved. Reverent custody is the obligation of the living to guard, remember, and treat the dead as more than discarded matter. Violation occurs when this custody is broken. The elements are mutually defining. The dead require a vessel of remembrance because they can no longer defend their own dignity. The grave or memorial matters because it carries the person's continuing claim on the living. The violation is offensive because it attacks both the dead and the community that remembers them. This gives grave desecration its distinctive emotional force. A grave is not only a location, it is a point of relation between the living, the dead, and the memory that binds them. To disturb or deface it is not merely to damage property. It is to reduce a person to an object and to interrupt the community's act of reverent remembrance. The character of this desecration is memorial injury. The dead are dishonored through the very forms by which their dignity was supposed to be preserved. Trump's politics frequently alleges that the nation's honored dead have been betrayed, veterans disrespected, soldiers forgotten, sacrifice dishonored, national mourning corrupted by weak or unpatriotic leaders. This charge is powerful because it invokes the dead as witnesses against the living. It claims that political opponents have failed in reverent custody. But the same rhetoric can authorize acts that critics experience as a second violation, in which sites of mourning are made to carry the language of personal triumph. An example can be seen in disputes over monumental construction near Arlington National Cemetery. For critics, especially veterans who object to such projects, the issue is not simply urban design or architectural preference. The memorial landscape between Arlington, the Lincoln Memorial, and the surrounding national sites already carries a solemn relation between military death, civic memory, and national mourning. The triad becomes tangible because the dignity of the dead is mediated not only through individual graves, but also through sightlines, silence, scale, and spatial orientation. If a triumphal monument is perceived as interrupting that landscape or subordinating it to personal commemoration, the offense becomes a violation of reverent custody. The dead are not directly touched, but the field of meaning around them is altered. The emotional injury comes from the sense that a place organized around sacrifice and mourning is being made to speak in the language of personal grandeur. This illustrates the weaponization of funerary desecration. The dead are invoked to accuse opponents of national betrayal, but memorial space is then made available for self-monumentalizing display. Reverence becomes a political instrument, mourning becomes a stage. The dead, who should restrain the ambitions of the living, are instead drawn into the spectacle of power. Political desecration produces conflict over who owns the nation's visible meaning. Flags, monuments, founding documents, public buildings, and national ceremonies do not simply represent a country. They become battlegrounds over who belongs, who betrayed the inheritance, and who has the authority to restore it. A leader can allege that enemies have degraded the nation's symbols, then convert those same symbols into instruments of personal rule, spectacle, or domination. The public is then pulled into a fight over whether the act is patriotic restoration or vulgar capture. That is the exploitable conflict. The symbol remains standing, but its meaning is forced into factional combat. The triad of political desecration is collective identity, public symbol, and degrading challenge. Political desecration emerges when a community's identity is embodied in a public symbol, and that symbol is degraded, defaced, burned, mocked, removed, occupied, or attacked. Collective identity is the sense of belonging, authority, sacrifice, continuity, or shared destiny associated with a nation or political community. The public symbol is the flag, constitution, monument, memorial, national cemetery, founding document, public building, or historically charged site through which that identity becomes visible. Degrading challenge is an act that contests the symbol's claim to reverence. The interrelation is unstable because political sacredness is often disputed. A symbol does not merely express identity, it helps construct identity. An act of degradation does not merely damage the symbol, it challenges the legitimacy of the identity the symbol represents. The community's reaction then determines whether the act is treated as desecration, dissent, liberation, or critique. This is why political desecration is so contested. One group may see the burning of a flag as an attack on national sacrifice. Another may see it as legitimate protest against state power. One group may see the removal of a monument as desecration of heritage. Another may see the monument itself as a desecration of justice or memory. The character of political desecration is contested sacredness. It reveals that political symbols do not simply represent shared meaning. They also expose conflicts over who belongs, what should be honored, and who has authority to define the sacred objects of public life. Trump's political style depends heavily on this contest. He repeatedly alleges that national symbols have been desecrated by others, the flag disrespected, the anthem dishonored, the border violated, the election stolen, the people betrayed, the Capitol corrupted. These allegations create a symbolic emergency. But the counter-practice often treats public symbols as if their highest meaning is to magnify the leader himself. The White House offers a powerful modern example because it is not merely an executive residence or government office. It functions as a public constitutional symbol, the visible house of an elected office that belongs symbolically to the people rather than to its temporary occupant. Alterations to its structure or uses therefore carry meaning beyond architecture or event planning. When critics object to demolition associated with a ballroom project, or to a combat sports spectacle staged on White House grounds, they are responding to a perceived shift in symbolic register. The collective identity mediated by the White House is one of constitutional continuity, public restraint, and civic inheritance. The degrading challenge, as critics experience it, is the conversion of that symbolic house into a setting for personal display, entertainment branding, or spectacle. The emotional force lies in the perceived vulgarization of the people's house. What should mediate Republican dignity begins to look like an extension of private taste, celebrity, or dominance. This is political desecration in weaponized form. The leader claims that he alone can protect the nation's symbols from enemies who degrade them. Yet the protected symbol is then annexed into a personal theater of power. The White House is not destroyed as a symbol, it is made to carry a different meaning. Public ownership is recoded as personal possession. Civic dignity is recoded as spectacle. The people's house is made to look like the leader's house. Cultural desecration produces conflict over whether the past should be confronted, purified, or controlled. Heritage is never just old material. It is the living chain by which a society decides what it will remember, honor, regret, preserve, or hide. A leader can claim that museums, schools, universities, monuments, or historians have desecrated national memory with shame or ideology, and then use that charge to justify erasure in the name of restoration. The conflict is useful because citizens are made to fight over whether truth itself is inheritance or betrayal. While they fight, public memory can be narrowed into approved memory. The triad of cultural desecration is inherited memory, cultural artifact, and destructive interruption. Cultural desecration emerges when inherited memory is carried by an artifact, tradition, site, language, artwork, monument, or interpretive practice, and that carrier is destroyed, defaced, neglected, looted, commodified, erased, or severed from its meaning. Inherited memory is the living relation between a community and its past. The cultural artifact is the visible or transmissible form through which that memory endures. Ruins, manuscripts, monuments, tools, artworks, archaeological sites, ceremonies, oral traditions, sacred landscapes, museum exhibits, or public history narratives. Destructive interruption is the act that damages the artifact or breaks its relation to the memory it bears. The elements depend on one another. Memory requires artifacts, places, and practices in order to persist across generations. Artifacts become culturally significant because they bear more than material value. Destruction becomes desecration when it damages not only the thing itself, but also the continuity the thing sustains. This distinguishes cultural desecration from ordinary destruction. Breaking a stone is not the same as destroying an ancient temple wall. Selling an object is not the same as looting a burial artifact from its historical context. Removing a display is not the same as moving furniture. The cultural form has become a mediator between generations, and its violation injures that chain of transmission. The character of cultural desecration is historical severance. What is attacked is not only an object from the past, but the living continuity between past, present, and future. Trump's cultural politics often begins with an allegation that national heritage has been desecrated by hostile interpreters. Museums are ideological, history is anti-American, universities are diseased, monuments have been attacked, and patriotic memory has been displaced by shame. This accusation presents the leader as restorer of a violated inheritance. but the restoration can become its own destructive interruption when historical complexity is treated as contamination and public memory is disciplined into approved reverence. Trump's cultural heritage example appears in controversies over the treatment of public history institutions and exhibits concerning slavery. Museums, historic sites, and interpretive exhibits do not merely transmit facts. They mediate inherited memory by deciding what a society is willing to face about its own origins, contradictions, injuries, and achievements. When an administration seeks to remove what it calls improper ideology from museums, or when an exhibit about slavery at a founding-era site is removed, critics experience the act as more than curatorial revision. The protected value is historical memory, especially memory of slavery as a constitutive part of American history. The mediator is the museum exhibit or public history site. The destructive interruption is erasure, sanitization, or forced patriotic reframing. The emotional injury comes from the sense that the past is being disciplined into comfort, and that the suffering of enslaved people is being made less visible in order to preserve a cleaner national self-image. This is the weaponization of cultural desecration. The charge that history has been defiled by ideology is used to justify a counter-violation of memory. The inherited past is not simply protected, it is purified. What cannot be made to serve the desired national story is treated as pollution. The result is not reverence for heritage, but control over what heritage is allowed to mean. Legal desecration produces conflict over whether law is accountability or persecution. That is its special danger. Law depends on public trust in process, but process is easy to poison once a leader convinces supporters that courts, prosecutors, investigations, elections, and judgments have already been corrupted by enemies. From there, retaliation can be framed as repair, punishment can be called justice, immunity for allies can be called correction, prosecution of enemies can be called restoration of the rule of law. The resulting conflict prevents the public from agreeing on whether law is restraining power or serving it. That confusion is the point. The triad of legal desecration is protected public value, legally recognized practice, and prohibited violation. Legal desecration emerges when a public value protected by law is embodied not only in an object or institution, but in a legally recognized practice, and that practice is violated in a way that degrades the value it exists to preserve. The protected public value may be justice, due process, equality before the law, public order, lawful authority, institutional independence, human dignity, religious liberty, property, memory, or the peaceful resolution of disputes. The legally recognized practice is the patterned conduct through which that value becomes real. A trial, an oath, a judicial proceeding, a lawful election, a certification process, a burial procedure, a legislative vote, a public hearing, a chain of custody, an investigation, a sentencing process, a pardon, or the orderly transfer of power. The prohibited violation is the act that breaks, corrupts, obstructs, falsifies, intimidates, exploits, or contemptuously disregards the practice. This shifts the focus from legal objects to legal relations. A courthouse, statute book, flag, seal, or government building can certainly mediate legal meaning, but law often lives most fully in repeated forms of conduct. The courtroom matters because adjudication happens there. The oath matters because truthful testimony depends on it. The ballot matters because lawful political authority is transferred through it. The chain of custody matters because justice requires evidence to remain trustworthy. The peaceful transfer of power matters because the office is supposed to survive the ambitions of the officeholder. The three elements shape one another. The protected public value gives the practice its seriousness. The legally recognized practice translates that value into an ordered sequence of acts. The prohibited violation damages the value by making the practice unreliable, corrupt, theatrical, coerced, or subordinate to private will. Legal desecration can therefore occur even where no sacred object is touched and no public building is damaged. A trial may be desecrated by intimidation, bribery, perjury, or showmanship that converts adjudication into spectacle. An election may be desecrated by fraud, suppression, coercion, or refusal to honor lawful results. A prosecutorial office may be desecrated when prosecution is treated as personal revenge rather than public duty. A pardon, investigation, oath, or judicial order may be desecrated when its legal form is used while its public meaning is hollowed out. The character of legal desecration is procedural profanation. It occurs when a practice designed to embody public legality is made to serve an alien purpose: domination, faction, corruption, vengeance, spectacle, evasion, or personal power. What is violated is not only a rule but the public trust that the rule-bearing practice was meant to sustain. This is why Trump's repeated charge of weaponization matters so much. He presents himself as the victim of a desecrated legal order. Prosecutors are corrupt, judges are biased, investigations are hoaxes, and criminal accountability is political persecution. That allegation identifies a protected public value, equal justice, and claims that enemies have profaned it. But the counter-practice allegedly repeats and intensifies the very violation it condemns. The language of anti-weaponization becomes a vehicle for weaponization in reverse. A sharper modern example appears in allegations that criminal prosecution itself has been converted into a practice of retaliation, absolution, and reversal. The issue is not merely whether a legal institution bears a political symbol, it is whether a legal practice that should embody rule-bound neutrality is made to serve personal punishment. The protected public value is the rule of law. The idea that prosecution should distinguish public justice from private revenge, true threats from protected speech, and legal accountability from political enmity. The legally recognized practice is criminal enforcement itself: investigation, charging discretion, indictment, trial, dismissal, pardon, and judicial review. The degrading violation is retaliatory inversion, where these practices still look formally legal but are alleged to have been turned toward factional reward and punishment. The Comey prosecutions make the injury especially concrete. In one case, charges against James Comey and Letitia James were dismissed after a court found that the prosecutor who brought them lacked lawful authority. In the later Seashell case, prosecutors treated Comey's image of shells arranged as 8647 as a criminal threat against the president. Critics and legal experts have argued that the case turns ambiguous political symbolism into felony menace, raising serious First Amendment concerns. That makes the alleged desecration more precise than a political opponent was prosecuted. A threat statute exists to protect real persons, including presidents, from real threats of violence. That is a legitimate public value. But if the statute is used to force an enemy's ambiguous expression into the role of criminal threat, the legal practice is degraded from protection into punishment. The process still has the outward form of law: indictment, prosecutors, motions, trial date, constitutional arguments. But its public meaning is inverted. The emotional force of this legal desecration lies in that inversion. The machinery of law is not merely redirected away from accountability. It is experienced as being turned back against those marked as enemies, including prosecutors, investigators, and prior officials associated with earlier cases. Law then ceases to appear as a disciplined public practice and begins to resemble a ritual of domination, where indictment itself becomes punishment and interpretive ambiguity becomes the state's weapon. In that light, the Anti-Weaponization Fund is not the central example but part of the same grammar. Once prosecution has been described as a desecration committed by enemies, remedies can be recoded as counter-punishment and factional repair. The boot grinds twice, first by threatening or prosecuting adversaries, then by using the rhetoric of legal restoration to vindicate allies, pardon loyalists, compensate the favored, or punish those who previously enforced the law. Legal desecration is therefore not only the misuse of one case, it is the conversion of legal process into a ritual system of accusation, revenge, and absolution. Ethical desecration produces conflict over who still counts as fully worthy of moral regard. It is the politics of lowering. A leader first claims that the moral community has been contaminated, betrayed, invaded, or poisoned. Then he marks some person or group as waste, vermin, criminal, diseased, alien, or disposable. The conflict that follows is not merely disagreement over policy. It is a struggle over whether the target remains inside the circle of human respect. This is useful because once a group has been morally lowered, cruelty can be sold as cleanliness, exclusion as protection, and domination as common sense. The triad of ethical desecration is intrinsic moral value, value-bearing form, and degrading reduction. Ethical desecration emerges when something with intrinsic moral value is embodied in a person, memory, principle, or practice, and that form is reduced to something beneath its proper dignity. Intrinsic moral value may include human dignity, autonomy, truth, justice, innocence, fidelity, memory, or moral personhood. The value-bearing form is the person, body, testimony, institution, ritual, name, image, narrative, or principle through which the value appears. Degrading reduction occurs when that form is treated as a tool, commodity, joke, weapon, spectacle, lie, or object of domination. The elements intensify one another. Intrinsic value establishes that some things should not be treated merely according to usefulness. The value-bearing form makes that moral claim visible and vulnerable. Degrading reduction violates the value by forcing its bearer into a lower category. This explains why ethical desecration may occur without obvious practical harm. A corpse may be mocked, a victim's memory exploited, a testimony falsified, a person humiliated, or justice invoked cynically. The injury lies in the lowering of what should not be lowered. The character of ethical desecration is moral profanation. It occurs when something worthy of respect in itself is treated as though it had only instrumental, contemptible, or disposable value. Trump's rhetoric often begins by alleging that moral order has been violated by others. Immigrants are criminals, opponents are vermin, critics are sick, institutions are corrupt, and enemies are poisoning the nation. The accusation claims to defend the moral community from contamination. But the act of defense frequently depends on degrading reduction. Whole classes of people are lowered beneath ordinary civic regard so that harsh treatment appears warranted. Trump's ethical example appears in rhetoric that describes an immigrant or ethnic community as garbage. The desecration here does not depend on physical contact with persons or property. It occurs through language that reduces human beings to refuse, contamination, or disposability. The triad is direct. The intrinsic moral value is human dignity. The value-bearing form is the person or community being named. The degrading reduction is the metaphor that converts persons into waste. This kind of language wounds because it does not merely criticize conduct, policy, crime, fraud, migration, or governance. It lowers an entire human identity into a category beneath moral regard. The emotional impact is therefore not simple offense at harsh words. It is the experience of being symbolically expelled from the circle of human respect. This is ethical desecration as weapon. By first alleging that the nation has been contaminated, the leader then treats degrading language as moral cleansing rather than moral violation. The target is not argued with. The target is lowered. Once lowered, exclusion, detention, expulsion, humiliation, or indifference can be framed as restoration of dignity rather than its destruction. Anthropological desecration produces conflict over the boundaries a culture treats as protected. Every society marks certain spaces, persons, rituals, and practices as set apart from ordinary force. Churches, schools, hospitals, homes, borders, ceremonies, and names all carry boundaries that tell people what kind of conduct belongs where. A leader can claim that enemies have crossed the most important boundary first, and then use that alleged crossing to justify crossing others. The conflict becomes a fight over refuge itself, whether any space remains protected from enforcement, spectacle, or political revenge. That fight is useful because once boundaries are redrawn, cruelty can appear merely administrative. The triad of anthropological desecration is sacred classification, cultural boundary, and transgressive crossing. Anthropological desecration emerges when a culture classifies something as sacred or set apart, establishes boundaries around it, and those boundaries are crossed in a way experienced as violation. Sacred classification is the social act of distinguishing certain persons, places, objects, times, foods, practices, names or rituals from ordinary life. The cultural boundary is the taboo, rule, ritual restriction, purity code, prohibition, or custom that protects this distinction. Transgressive crossing is the act that enters, touches, uses, exposes, consumes, mocks, or mixes what the culture says must remain separate. The elements define one another dynamically. Classification creates the sacred category. Boundary gives that category practical force. Transgression reveals the category's importance by showing what happens when the boundary fails. From this perspective, desecration is not limited to religion. Every society draws lines around what it treats as untouchable, unmarketable, unspeakable, inviolable, or ritually dangerous. Desecration reveals the structure of those lines. The character of anthropological desecration is cultural exposure. By observing what a society treats as desecration, one discovers what it regards as sacred, polluted, dangerous, honorable, forbidden, or identity-defining. Trump's politics repeatedly contests cultural boundaries by alleging that enemies have crossed them first. Migrants crossed the border, protesters crossed the line, educators crossed into indoctrination, judges crossed into politics, and bureaucrats crossed into treason. The accusation of boundary violation then authorizes counter-crossings that would otherwise appear indecent, excessive, or cruel. Trump's anthropological example appears in the rescission of protections limiting immigration enforcement at sensitive locations such as churches and schools. Such places are not sacred in identical ways, but cultures often treat them as set apart from ordinary coercive intrusion. Houses of worship are marked by spiritual refuge. Schools are marked by childhood, formation, and trust. Hospitals, similarly, are often understood as spaces of care before enforcement. The triad is cultural as much as legal. Sacred classification marks certain spaces as requiring restraint. Cultural boundaries tell officials, communities, and vulnerable people that these places should not be treated like ordinary enforcement terrain. Transgressive crossing occurs when those boundaries are revoked or ignored. The emotional force comes from the collapse of refuge. A church or school ceases to feel like a protected zone and begins to feel like an exposed frontier of state power. This is anthropological desecration weaponized through enforcement. The administration frames the border as the original violated boundary and then uses that allegation to justify crossing other boundaries: sanctuary, schooling, worship, care, and trust. The result is not merely stricter immigration policy, it is a redrawing of the culture's map of protected places. What had been set apart as refuge is reclassified as terrain. Psychological desecration produces conflict over injury, attachment, and recognition. People are not attached only to policies. They are attached to names, places, flags, graves, languages, stories, landscapes, and symbols that hold their sense of belonging. A leader can mobilize people by telling them their attachments have been mocked or stolen, and he can injure others by renaming, ridiculing, or degrading what they love. The conflict is powerful because material harm is not required. The object may remain physically intact while its public meaning is altered. That lets the leader provoke real emotional rupture while dismissing the injury as oversensitivity, nostalgia, or political correctness. The triad of psychological desecration is deep attachment, symbolic object, and perceived violation. Psychological desecration emerges when a person or group forms deep attachment to a symbolic object and then experiences that object as violated, polluted, mocked, or degraded. Deep attachment is the emotional investment placed in a person, memory, object, place, principle, or image. The symbolic object is the concrete or imagined form that holds this attachment: a photograph, grave, flag, home, religious object, keepsake, body, name, story, or moral ideal. Perceived violation is the experience that the object has been attacked in a way that threatens the emotional meaning it carries. The elements are inseparable. Attachment charges the object with significance. The object gives attachment a focus. Violation turns damage to the object into damage to the self's symbolic world. This is why desecration produces emotions that may exceed practical harm. A ruined photograph, defaced grave, mocked ritual, or insulted memory can produce disgust, grief, rage, or moral horror disproportionate to the object's material value. The person is not responding only to matter. The person is responding to the collapse of a protected meaning. The character of psychological desecration is affective rupture. The violation breaks an emotional boundary and makes the world feel less ordered, less safe, or less faithful to what matters. Trump's political method is unusually attuned to this affective dimension. He repeatedly tells supporters that their attachments have been mocked, stolen, invaded, or humiliated. Their country, flag, religion, language, police, soldiers, industries, towns, history, and way of life. That rhetoric produces a felt desecration before any policy occurs. It trains supporters to experience political disagreement as symbolic injury. But the same method also inflicts affective rupture on others by targeting their own names, places, memories, and attachments. The renaming of Denali as Mount McKinley illustrates psychological desecration because the injury centers on attachment, place, and name. For many Alaska Native people and many Alaskans more broadly, Denali is not merely a label. It carries ancestry, language, geography, continuity, and belonging. The name is part of the symbolic object itself. The triad is therefore emotionally concentrated. Deep attachment gathers around the mountain and its indigenous name. The symbolic object is not only the peak but the named place as held in memory and identity. The perceived violation is the replacement of that name with one associated with a distant political figure who had no comparable relation to the mountain. The injury is effective because renaming feels like dispossession. The place remains physically present, but the recognized public language for belonging to it is altered. This is psychological desecration as political force. A name becomes a site where recognition is granted or withdrawn. The leader claims to restore a national attachment, but in doing so ruptures another community's attachment to place. The act is powerful precisely because the material mountain remains unchanged. What is changed is the symbolic world through which people belong to it. Sociological desecration produces conflict over public norms, what a society is allowed to honor in common. A symbol in public space is never just decoration. It says something about who belongs, what the community respects, and which claims deserve recognition. A leader can turn such symbols into loyalty tests, accusing one side of polluting public life, and then removing, replacing, or occupying the symbol in the name of neutrality. The conflict is useful because it forces the public to argue not only over the symbol, but over the norm the symbol made visible. The act sorts the population into defenders and desecrators. The triad of sociological desecration is collective norms, shared symbols, and public rupture. Sociological desecration emerges when collective norms are embodied in shared symbols, and an act against those symbols produces public conflict or rupture. Collective norms are the expectations by which a group defines what should be honored, protected, respected, or forbidden. Shared symbols are the flags, monuments, ceremonies, names, memorials, institutions, texts, or public spaces that make those norms visible. Public rupture occurs when an act is interpreted as violating the symbol and, through it, the social order. The elements reinforce each other. Norms require symbols to become publicly recognizable. Symbols depend on norms for their authority. Public rupture occurs when disagreement over the symbol exposes disagreement over the norm itself. Desecration in sociology is therefore not merely an act, but a social process. Someone violates or appears to violate a symbol. Others interpret the act, condemn it, defend it, imitate it, punish it, or debate it. The community then renegotiates what the symbol means and whether the violated boundary still holds. The character of sociological desecration is norm revelation. Public reactions to alleged desecration disclose what a society honors, what it fears, what it represses, and where its shared meanings are unstable. Trump's politics repeatedly turn symbols into tests of social allegiance. Kneeling during the anthem, displaying a flag, naming a holiday, Teaching a history lesson, flying a banner, painting a street, or removing a monument becomes evidence of whether one belongs to the moral community. The accusation of desecration does not simply condemn an act. It sorts the public into those who honor the group and those who have betrayed it. The removal of Black Lives Matter Plaza offers a sociological example because the mural functioned as a visible public claim about civic values. It did not merely decorate a street, it announced a norm. That racial justice, protest against police violence, and the assertion of black life belonged in public space near the symbolic center of federal power. The triad is social and conflictual. Collective norms were embodied in the shared symbol of the mural and plaza. Public rupture emerged when political pressure led to its removal. For supporters, the removal felt like the erasure of a civic commitment. For opponents, the mural may have represented partisan capture of public space. That conflict is precisely why the example matters sociologically. Desecration here is not only the act of removal, it is the revelation that the society is divided over what its public symbols should honor. This is sociological desecration weaponized as public sorting. The removal does not merely change a street. It dramatizes whose symbols will be allowed to occupy civic space and whose symbols will be treated as pollution. In that sense, the act performs the broader thesis. An alleged desecration of public neutrality becomes the justification for a counter-desecration experienced by others as erasure. Artistic desecration produces conflict over whether culture is free interpretation or captured display. Art often works by reconfiguring inherited meanings, which means it can expose false reverence as easily as it can violate genuine reverence. That ambiguity makes cultural institutions tempting targets. A leader can accuse artists, museums, theaters, universities, or patrons of desecrating culture through ideology, elitism, or contempt for the people, and then demand that art serve loyalty, patriotism, branding, or personal honor. The conflict is useful because it makes independence look like corruption and capture look like restoration. The triad of artistic desecration is inherited meaning, aesthetic reconfiguration, and symbolic transgression. Artistic desecration emerges when inherited meaning is taken up by artistic form and reconfigured in a way that appears to violate, invert, expose, or degrade it. Inherited meaning is the established significance of a religious image, national symbol, moral ideal, cultural myth, genre, tradition, or canonical figure. Aesthetic reconfiguration is the artist's act of transforming that material through irony, parody, fragmentation, juxtaposition, embodiment, inversion, or shock. Symbolic transgression is the resulting perception that the work has crossed a boundary of reverence. The three elements create the ambiguity of art. Inherited meaning gives the work something charged to transform. Aesthetic reconfiguration changes the viewer's relation to that meaning. Symbolic transgression arises when the transformation is experienced not as interpretation but as violation. This is why art can be accused of desecration and defended as revelation at the same time. A work may appear to profane a sacred image, yet it may also expose hypocrisy, violence, sentimentality, idolatry, or false reverence within the culture that protects the image. Artistic desecration therefore often turns on whether the audience sees the work as destruction of meaning or criticism of a degraded meaning already present. The character of artistic desecration is interpretive crisis. The work forces a struggle over whether sacred meaning has been violated, renewed, exposed, or liberated. Trump's cultural style often treats art less as an autonomous practice than as a vehicle for honor, loyalty, patriotic affirmation, or personal recognition. He alleges that cultural institutions have been desecrated by elites, ideology, vulgarity, anti-Americanism, or exclusion of his supporters. Yet the proposed cure can be another form of desecration. The aesthetic institution is made to serve political branding rather than artistic meaning. Trump's example appears in disputes over the Kennedy Center, proposed renaming, leadership changes, artist cancellations, and judicial intervention. The Kennedy Center is not only a venue, it is an aesthetic institution carrying inherited meaning, national arts, public culture, presidential memorialization, and a certain ideal of non-partisan civic patronage. When such an institution is pulled into personal political branding, the triad becomes unstable. The inherited meaning is the Kennedy Center's role as a national cultural memorial. The aesthetic institution mediates that meaning through performances, artists, audiences, architecture, and name. The symbolic transgression occurs when the institution appears to be reconfigured around the identity of a living political figure. The emotional impact on artists and audiences comes from the sense that a shared cultural house has been converted into a contested emblem of power. The result is interpretive crisis. Is the institution being restored, politicized, renamed, captured, or profaned? This is artistic desecration weaponized through patronage and naming. The leader claims to rescue culture from ideological capture, but the rescue itself risks converting culture into an instrument of power. The institution is not merely censored from outside, its inherited meaning is reauthored from within. Art is asked to carry the leader's name. Desecration of memory produces conflict over which past a community must carry forward. Public memory is never only about what happened. It is about what the present is required to honor, confess, mourn, or outgrow. A leader can claim that heritage has been desecrated by shame, revisionism, iconoclasm, or political correctness, and then restore older symbols as if restoration itself were innocence. The conflict is useful because it turns history into a loyalty test. To question the restored memory is to betray the group. To accept it is to participate in the leader's chosen inheritance. The triad of mnemonic desecration is remembered significance, identity-bearing narrative, and distortion or trivialization. Desecration of memory emerges when a remembered event, person, sacrifice, or trauma is carried by an identity-bearing narrative, and that narrative is distorted, exploited, trivialized, denied, or mocked. Remembered significance is the weight given to a past event or person. The identity-bearing narrative is the story, ritual, anniversary, monument, testimony, name, or communal practice through which that significance is preserved. Distortion or trivialization occurs when the narrative is falsified, cheapened, commercialized, politicized in bad faith, denied, or made into spectacle. The elements are mutually constitutive. The remembered event requires narrative to remain meaningful. The narrative draws authority from the event. Distortion harms both by breaking the faithful relation between past occurrence and present remembrance. This form of desecration is especially important because the sacred object may be immaterial. What is violated is not necessarily a body, grave, flag, or artifact, but the integrity of remembrance itself. Memory becomes a sacred space within identity, and its violation is experienced as an attack on the self-understanding of a person or community. The character of mnemonic desecration is identity wound. When memory is desecrated, the past is not simply misdescribed. The community's relation to itself is damaged. Trump's memory politics often begins with the charge that America's past has been desecrated by shame, revisionism, iconoclasm, or political correctness. That charge is powerful because it presents memory itself as a victim. But the counter-memory can become desecrating when it restores honor to what should be judged, trivializes the harms embedded in the past, or displaces newer narratives of inclusion. The restoration of Army base names associated with Confederate generals provides a strong example of desecration in memory and identity. Military base names do not merely identify locations. They teach a story about honor, service, loyalty, and national belonging. When Confederate-associated names are removed and then restored or functionally revived, the dispute is about which past the military is being asked to carry forward. The triad is mnemonic. Remembered significance concerns the Civil War, Union, slavery, emancipation, rebellion, and the later struggle to make military honor more inclusive. The identity-bearing narrative is embedded in base names and the figures they commemorate. The distortion or trivialization occurs when Confederate honorific memory is restored within the symbolic space of the United States Army. For critics, the injury lies in honoring those who fought against the United States while displacing newer commemorations of black soldiers, women, and other service members. The emotional force comes from the sense that the national story is being bent backward toward a memory that should have been judged rather than revived. This is mnemonic desecration weaponized as restoration. The leader claims to repair a desecrated heritage, but the repaired heritage may itself desecrate the memory of union, emancipation, and those excluded from older honor systems. The dispute is not only over names, it is over whether public memory will confront betrayal and slavery, or convert them back into symbols of martial pride. Desecration, taken as a general human concept, produces conflict over what must not be reduced to ordinary use. Every society places certain values beyond mere possession, pricing, ridicule, force, or factional convenience. Those values need mediators. Offices, rituals, names, graves, courts, memories, buildings, ceremonies, relationships, and forms of access. A leader weaponizes desecration by claiming that enemies have already violated the protected value, then seizing the mediator and making it serve his own power. The conflict that follows is the point. One side experiences violation, the other is told to see restoration. In that confusion, the sacred or quasi-sacred thing is not simply destroyed, it is captured. The encompassing triad of desecration is set-apart value, protected mediator, and degrading violation. Desecration emerges when a value set apart from ordinary treatment is mediated through some protected form, practice, place, person, memory, symbol, or relation, and that mediator is degraded in a way that denies, corrupts, or humiliates the value it carries. The first element, set-apart value, is whatever a person or community treats as requiring special reverence, restraint, fidelity, dignity, or protection. This value may be religious, moral, legal, political, cultural, psychological, artistic, historical, or personal. It need not be sacred in a formal theological sense. It is sacred in the broader human sense that it is not supposed to be handled as a mere instrument, commodity, ornament, weapon, joke, or possession. The second element, protected mediator, should be understood broadly. A mediator may be physical, but it does not have to be. It may be an object, building, body, grave, monument, flag, artwork, text, or relic. But it may also be a practice, office, name, ceremony, boundary, oath, memory, story, role, relationship, or tradition. The mediator is whatever allows the set-apart value to become visible, repeatable, shared, enacted, or preserved in human life. This broadening matters because many of the things people most fear seeing desecrated are not merely things. They are ordered relations. A trial, a funeral, a sacrament, a vote, a memorial silence, a name, a promise, a family grave tradition, a language, or a public office can be desecrated because each mediates a value that depends on right treatment. The value becomes vulnerable precisely because it has entered the world through a form that human beings can misuse. The third element, degrading violation, is the act or pattern that forces the mediator to carry a meaning contrary to the value it was supposed to protect. The violation may be physical destruction, but it may also be mockery, falsification, exploitation, coercion, trivialization, corruption, appropriation, erasure, or profaning use. Desecration occurs when the mediator is made to betray its own value. The three elements are mutually defining. The set-apart value explains why the mediator matters. The mediator gives the value a worldly form and therefore a point of vulnerability. The degrading violation reveals the protected boundary by crossing it and shows what kind of reverence has been broken. The general definition is therefore that desecration is the emergent violation that occurs when a set-apart value is embodied, enacted, remembered, or preserved through a protected mediator, and that mediator is degraded in a way that attacks the value it exists to carry. This general definition brings the whole pattern into focus. Trump's weaponization of desecration depends on treating public life as a field of violated sacred things: nation, border, history, law, faith, office, people, memory, and honor. But the recurring countermove is to occupy the mediator that carries the value and make it serve the leader's own power. A final modern example that gathers the broader pattern together is the Trump meme coin dinner for top holders. The protected value is public constitutional trust, the expectation that presidential attention, presence, and access belong to the public office, not to a private market. The mediator is presidential access itself. That access is not merely social contact with a famous person. It is contact with the holder of public power, surrounded by the authority, prestige, and symbolic force of the presidency. The degrading violation is the conversion of that access into a purchasable private benefit tied to a financial instrument from which the president and his associates may profit. This example clarifies why desecration need not involve physical destruction. Nothing has to be smashed, burned, or defaced. The injury lies in the changed meaning of the mediator. Presidential access, which should signify public responsibility, is made to signify market rank. Civic trust, which should be held in common, is converted into a scarce commodity for top buyers. The form remains recognizable as public office, but its meaning is bent toward private monetization. That is why the meme coin dinner can serve as a concluding image for the whole concept. Desecration occurs when something set apart from ordinary use is forced into a lower order of meaning. Here, the set-apart value is not holiness, burial dignity, cultural memory, or artistic inheritance, but public trust in constitutional office. The mediator is not an altar, grave, monument, museum, or ritual, but the president's official presence and the access attached to it. The violation is not vandalism, but commodification. The broader lesson is that desecration is harm to a value-bearing relation. A protected mediator may be an object, but it may also be a practice, name, office, ceremony, memory, landscape, or form of access. What matters is that a community has placed a value beyond ordinary use and entrusted some mediator to carry it. Desecration occurs when that mediator is made to betray the value it was supposed to preserve. In this sense, the meme coin dinner makes the general structure unusually tangible. It shows civic reverence being translated into transactional privilege. It turns office into access, access into commodity, and commodity into status before power. The emotional injury comes from the perception that what should belong to the public has been enclosed, priced, and sold. Across these examples, the same grammar recurs. Trump alleges desecration first, the nation has been invaded, the law has been weaponized, history has been corrupted, faith has been mocked, the military has been dishonored, and the people have been betrayed. That allegation identifies a sacred or quasi-sacred value. It then identifies an enemy who has supposedly violated that value. The enemy is degraded as corrupt, alien, criminal, fake, diseased, treasonous, or subhuman. Once that degradation has occurred, counter-violation becomes emotionally plausible. It appears not as norm-breaking, but as restoration. The danger is not simply that Trump desecrates what others revere, it is that he turns desecration into a method of rule. He first teaches his followers to experience public life as a field of violated sacred things, the nation invaded, the vote stolen, the courts corrupted, history defiled, religion mocked, the people betrayed. That accusation creates the emotional license for counter-violation. Once the sacred thing is said to be under attack, the leader's own violations can appear not as violations at all, but as acts of rescue. This is the core inversion. The law may be profaned in the name of saving law. Memory may be erased in the name of restoring history. Public office may be monetized in the name of representing the people. Refuge may be breached in the name of defending borders. Art, ceremony, names, buildings, graves, symbols, and institutions may all be occupied in the name of protecting them. What should restrain power is made to serve power. That is why desecration is not incidental to Trump's politics. It is one of its organizing grammars. Allegation identifies the sacred value. Degradation marks the enemy as unworthy of protection. Retaliation converts violation into purification. The result is a politics in which domination can present itself as restoration, cruelty as reverence, corruption as justice, and personal possession as public meaning. Trump's weaponization of desecration therefore exposes a deeper civic vulnerability. Public life depends on mediators that no one fully owns. Law, office, memory, ritual, language, history, place, and trust. These mediators hold the common world together because they stand above ordinary private use. When they are seized, branded, priced, purified, or turned against enemies, the injury is more than symbolic. The public loses confidence that its own forms still belong to it. The desecration is complete when the people's house looks like the leader's house, when public memory becomes approved memory, when law becomes loyalty, when access to office becomes a commodity, and when reverence itself becomes a weapon. At that point, the sacred has not merely been violated, it has been captured. And a captured sacred order no longer restrains power, it consecrates it. The purpose of this system is not merely symbolic victory. Desecration is useful because it manufactures conflict at the level where people are hardest to reason with. Faith, law, death, nation, memory, dignity, identity, and belonging. Once those values are made to feel violated, politics no longer feels like negotiation over public choices. It feels like emergency. And in an emergency, people tolerate what they would otherwise reject. That is the governing advantage. A public fighting over desecration is a public that has been moved away from ordinary accountability. Citizens are no longer asking only who benefited, who profited, who abused office, who bent the law, who received access, or who consolidated power. They are pulled into a deeper and more exhausting fight over whether the act was violation or restoration, corruption or justice, cruelty or protection, blasphemy or faithfulness, erasure or patriotism. The leader benefits because the public is forced to argue over meaning while power acts in fact. This is why division and distraction are not side effects. They are the harvest. Each desecration splits the public into incompatible realities. Critics experience injury and demand recognition of the violation. Supporters are told that the same act is necessary repair. The argument then becomes self-consuming. The public must litigate the symbol, the motive, the joke, the outrage, the hypocrisy, the double standard, the context, and the counter-example. Meanwhile, the boundary has already been crossed. The deeper purpose is permission. Weaponized desecration teaches supporters that restraint is complicity and violation is courage. If the sacred thing has already been profaned by enemies, then the leader's counter-violation can be experienced as purification. The more shocking the act, the more it proves his willingness to do what weaker figures will not. Desecration becomes a credential. It shows that the leader is not bound by the decayed rules of the corrupted order. He can break them because, in the story he tells, they were already broken by those who deserve no protection. That is how domination hides inside restoration. Public office can be personalized because the leader claims to embody the people. Law can be turned against enemies because law was supposedly weaponized first. Memory can be purified because history was supposedly corrupted. Sacred imagery can be appropriated because faith was supposedly under siege. Access can be sold because proximity to power is recoded as tribute to the movement. In each case, the violation is not defended as violation. It is renamed as rescue. The final purpose then is to make power harder to oppose. A normal abuse can be investigated, named, and resisted. A desecrating abuse arrives wrapped in sacred injury. To oppose it is to risk being cast as an enemy of the very value being invoked: the nation, the law, the dead, the faithful, the people, the past. That is the trap. The leader seizes the mediator, claims the value, violates both, and then accuses critics of hating what he has just captured. A politics organized this way does not merely degrade public life. It converts public life into a series of staged emergencies that only the desecrator can claim to resolve. The people are kept angry, wounded, divided, and unsure which institutions still belong to them. That uncertainty is useful. A confused public is easier to rule. A divided public is easier to loot. A public forced to defend the meaning of its own sacred things has less strength left to defend the things themselves.